Fundamentally, there are only two core philosophies governing the design of free-to-play games. Rule number one, anyone at any time can download and play your game without having to pay any money. And rule number two is that anyone who has downloaded your game can continue to play that game and expect to be able to get new content updates without having to pay any money unless they wanted to. So, with these two rules in mind, the entire focus of free-to-play game monetization design is about, firstly, how do I make money without players having to pay for it? And secondly, how do I design and package my content so that players will want to pay for it even though they don't have to? There are two mainstream methods that we use to achieve these objectives: in-game mobile ads and in-app purchases, or IAPs. Depending on the kind of game that you have, and more importantly, the kind of audience that you're trying to target, you'll likely use a different mix of ads and IAP in your monetization strategy. Many game developers that I've talked to over the years will determine the mix of IAPs and ads that they'll use in their monetization strategy based on the type of game that they're making. For example, developers of hyper-casual games tend to lean more heavily on ad monetization and less so on IAPs. Conversely, developers of more hardcore strategy games will lean almost exclusively on IAPs, often not using ad monetization at all within their games. Although determining game monetization strategy based on game genre will sometimes work, the biggest problem with designing monetization strategy by game genre is that you don't know why it works and you don't know why it doesn't work when it doesn't. And if you don't understand why it works, you really can't fine-tune and improve your monetization strategy over time. This brings us to the discussion of the first key concept of monetization design: understanding your game's demographic mix. A good understanding of the demographic makeup of your player base is critical to crafting a successful and effective monetization strategy. The reason is because different kinds of players will monetize in different ways. Although gender does play a role in monetization strategy, the most impactful demographic aspect to pay attention to when designing your monetization strategy is age demographic. For the purposes of this masterclass, let's use 4 different levels of age demographic classification, and let's take a look at the different behavior that each of these groups may exhibit when faced with either ad monetization or IAP-based monetization. The first group is the preteens groups, a player base that we typically define as 12 or under. Typically, the preteens audience don't mind watching ads inside of a game, especially if it's an incentivized ad format which allows them to get some kind of in-game reward out of the ad experience. From an IAP monetization perspective though, preteen player audiences tend to have a low threshold or gaming budget that they're able to spend consistently on games. The second group is our teenage player audiences, one of the sweet spot demographics in mobile gaming today. Like the preteens, the teenage group has a high tolerance for ad monetization, especially if it's well-designed, incentivized ads. In addition, they also tend to have a small but regular gaming budget that they can allocate to spending in IAP in your games. The third group in our demographic definition is the young adults group, which we define as young adults aged 19 through 30. Young adults are one of the most active and high-value gaming demographic groups. They tend to have a medium to high regular gaming budget that they allocate to spending in games, and although they have a tolerance for in-game ads, they often much prefer spending a little bit of money on IAP if it can get them a better gaming experience. Last but not least is the mature adults group. This group of players tend to have a much lower tolerance level for ad monetization, especially if it's non-optional ads which are forced upon the player experience. Conversely though, they also have one of the highest disposable income and gaming budget levels, so designing the right IAP monetization strategy to attract the mature adult audience can yield great returns for your game's monetization. So, assuming that we've ascertained that a good proportion of your game's target demographic players fall into the first 2 to 3 groups of the age demographic, let's start looking at your ad monetization design strategy. The first thing that we need to consider are all of the mainstream ad types that are prevalent and available inside of mobile games. These ad types will all fall into two categories of user experience. The first kind of ad experience are the non-optional ad experiences. Non-optional ads is something that consumers have grown used to over the years. They're often seen as a necessary evil in order for consumers to be able to enjoy free content, whether it's in the form of video content on TV or YouTube, or in our case, game content. Non-optional ad types, which are currently mainstream in the mobile games market, include interstitial ad types, which are injected or appear at certain defined points within the game and typically take over the entire game screen. And banner ad types that typically take up a portion of your game's user interface, but are typically constantly displayed whenever a player visits that section of your game's interface. The key thing to master when designing monetization with non-optional ads is frequency. Display too many ads in a short period of time, and you could be driving away your players with a bad game and ad experience, lowering your game's retention. Play too few ads, and you could be leaving a significant amount of money on the table and hurting the monetization for your game. And the metric that we use to measure the frequency of ads displayed is called impressions per DAU. In simple terms, it's the average number of ads that we would display to a single active user in a single day of game experience. The key things to remember about optimizing the impressions per DAU for your game is that every game has a different sweet spot. You can certainly reference the impressions per DAU frequency of other popular games that are similar to yours, but at the end of the day, the best way to decide the optimal impressions per DAU for your game is through experimentation and A/B testing. The second important thing to remember is that the optimal impressions per DAU may change over time as the player demographics change within your game, as well as the tolerance that each demographic has for non-optional ads changes over time. While the objective with non-optional ads is to achieve optimal monetization without annoying and driving away your player base, the challenge and objective of optional ad formats is much more interesting. The most prevalent type of optional ad is the rewarded video format. Since players don't have to watch an optional ad and they need to be encouraged to watch the ad, the challenge with designing optional ad types is how do I encourage and incentivize players to watch more ads while they're playing the game. Just like non-optional ads, optional ad types can take many forms. The mainstream types of optional ads inside of mobile games include rewarded video, rewarded playable ads, as well as offer walls. In general, we would refer to these ad types as incentivized or rewarded ad types, where the goal is to design incentives which encourage the players to want to watch these ads. The interesting thing about rewarded or incentivized ad types is that their monetization design is much more similar to IAP monetization design than it is to non-optional ads monetization design. So much so that we would treat the monetization design of rewarded video ads alongside and together with IAP monetization design. And this takes us to the next framework in the monetization segment, designing a game economy.